and gentlemen, please welcome Rob Chapman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I hugely appreciate it, and everyone for coming as well. So, a few things before I begin reading this. I take autism to be a difference, not a disorder. This is very important for me. I take most of the problems that autistic people experience to actually be political in nature. Often I would be talking about them. That's the kind of thing I included a lot of in my PhD thesis. Tonight I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm going to talk about some of the kind of problems that autistic people might experience, regardless of kind of like ableist kind of structures in society and things like that. I just want to be clear that when I do talk about kind of what we call something like characteristically autistic problems, it doesn't mean that I think autism itself is a problem. It's perfectly coherent to think that different kinds of people, different groups can have their own kinds of problems, but still be, not a problem overall. I just wanted to flag that up. I'm going to say autism, not the autism spectrum or any of the particular names. I mean this in a general sense. I focus mostly on autistic people who don't have other intersecting disabilities, like very maybe kind of multiple learning disabilities and things like that, although I hope it's relevant there too. And this is it's worth saying, I guess this is the result of, I began reading Wittgenstein, I was quite young, I was about 18, and I didn't know anything about philosophy at the time. And I found him I didn't really understand him, of course, as you wouldn't, but I found him very helpful in certain ways for understanding the world and kind of coming to terms with things like ambiguity and change and things like this. I didn't know at the time that I was autistic. I got a late diagnosis a few years after that, and all I knew at the time was that the world was a very confusing place, and Wittgenstein seemed to help. So in retrospect, I've kind of thought that there might be some connection there, and I've thought about this slowly over years. I've tried to give a couple of papers on it, exploring it, and I never quite felt like I could really coherently get those kind of things. This isn't a paper about me, by the way, it's a paper. I'm just like saying where it came from. So I've got to stop talking about me in a second, but this is my attempt after thinking about it slowly for almost a decade in various ways to say something about it. In the medical literature, autistic difference has often been portrayed as being directly traced back to and wholly explained by key neurocognitive differences that are inherent to all autistic individuals. On this dominant cognitivist view, as I shall call it, all characteristically autistic problems are essentially problems in understanding that in turn stem from problems in information processing. So each case of behavioural or communication difficulty, for example, can be explained in reference to processing issues that are inherent, or perhaps dispositional at least, to autism's unique neurocognitive style. Nonetheless, although they still do dominate autism representations, in recent years the neurocognitivist framing has been widely criticised and in some cases begun to be abandoned. This is because neurological and cognitive research, or largely at least, has found many conflicting findings that, as I shall come back to, make this framing hard to sustain. In light of this, my aim today is to resurrect an alternative to the cognitivist framing, namely the Wittgensteinian framing. Wittgensteinian accounts differ from the cognitivist accounts because they take human thought and language to be something that occurs within a shared form of life and the various shared concerns and practices of its life forms, more centrally than being a matter of individual information processing. According to its proponents, one of the strengths of this alternative framing is that it retains room to see autism as both having a unified nature on the one hand, while simultaneously fitting with the conflicting scientific findings on the other. Whilst earlier accounts from a Wittgensteinian framework are problematic for reasons I shall discuss, there is nonetheless room for drawing on Wittgenstein for both accounting for autistic thinking and, perhaps more importantly, for providing insight into how to improve the chances of thriving for autistic individuals. Indeed, for the purposes of this talk, my own interest in this picture of autism resides in its practical consequences as much as its explanatory power, although it has that too. As we shall see, Wittgenstein has a lot more to say in both these regards than has previously been thought. So it's first worth saying a bit about the neurocognitivist framework, why it's dominated and why it's now slowly being abandoned, or it seems to be. Well, on the cognitivist accounts, autistic thinking has been characterized as hyper-systemizing or hyper-mechanistic. This kind of basically means that autistic individuals think very logically, making us good at processing fixed systematic strands of information, but much worse when it comes to anything else. At the same time, autistic perception has been portrayed as context blind or as lacking central coherence. This means that autistic brains process meaning with less sensitivity to the relevant context than neurologically typical brains do, leading to a focus on details at the expense of wholes, missing the gist of certain meanings, into a fragmented and unfiltered sensory perceptual world. In turn, any problems with cognizing empathy, understanding the social world, are taken to stem from these more fundamental general differences, since empathizing both requires context sensitivity, and since the social world is precisely not governed by clear, fixed rules. So in short, whilst all thinking on the cognitivist framework, all thinking is a bit like computer thinking, all human thinking is a bit like computer thinking, there's often that analogy, and sometimes people who kind of use this framework say like autistic people have slightly different processors, it's a different kind of processor, and of course they think that we're slightly more like computers than everything else, kind of robotic somehow. So the cognitivist framework is widely cited, and it's worth considering why. One reason is that the cognitivist accounts have been taken to be successful, is that they help explain autistic experience from the inside out, from within autistic subjectivity. Many autistic people identify as rational and report noticing details that others miss, for example, and many report sensory sensitivities and the experience of an unfiltered world. Moreover, there's some evidence from various studies showing that autistic people do tend to be highly rational thinkers, and so forth. So these accounts are kind of intuitive for both many autistic people and those around them, since they can help explain the world as autistic people seem to experience it. This is just very helpful for a number of reasons. Now, on top of this, the cognitivist theories also typically indicate methods for kind of dealing with autistic problems in understanding, based on how they frame the autistic mind. And I'm just going to give two examples. So one comes from the University of Cambridge, where Simon Baron-Cohen and colleagues, and these are the people who came up with the hyper-systemizing theory of autism. They've developed an interactive DVD. DVDs are a bit dated now, I guess, but it was in 2003 or so, that helps autistic people to learn, understand emotions via facial expressions. On the DVD, 6 actors each play 412 distinctly labelled expressions, and the viewer is supposed to kind of memorize these and then map them onto the world in order to better function within it. So in other words, the autistic viewer is supposed to draw on their strong systemizing capacities in order to compensate for problems in empathizing. Now, just to give another example comes from Autisme Central in Brussels, where Peter Vermeulen, he came up with the context blindness theory of autism. He reports that teaching the Socratic method to autistic children helps them learn to deal with conceptual problems, grasp vague concepts, and thus improve general functioning and kind of mode of life. So this again is taken precisely to work because it uses reflective logical thinking in order to understand complicated categories and abstract concepts. Vermeulen takes to be problematic for autistic children, given his notion of autism as context blindness. For all these reasons, and others I shall not discuss, the cognitivist approach has dominated representations of the autistic mind. Still, this approach is not without its problems. On the one hand, the research on autistic neurology and brain functioning has uncovered a vast underlying heterogeneity, making the notion that it has a neurocognitive essence very hard to maintain. On the other hand, there is no single cognitive trait that has been found to accurately compass, let alone explain, all manifestations of autistic minds. So whilst it's true that there might be tendencies towards, for instance, enhanced logical thinking, or problems processing the social world and so forth, there's no single cognitive trait that is found to be shared by all, or even the majority of autistic people. Finally, others still have argued that the cognitivist theories can obscure either relational or wider political issues by framing them merely as individual, kind of natural issues. Given these various worries, at least some previous leaders in the quest for a cognitive essence of autism have suggested abandoning the notion of a unified autism as such. Indeed, others have gone so far as to suggest that the concept of autism simply lacks any kind of scientific validity and should be abandoned. In short, at the very least, when it comes to autism, and despite the various benefits, we seem to have reached peak cognitivism. Now, given these various issues, it may be worth turning to a different way of framing autism that doesn't rely on the requirement of a biological or cognitive essence, namely the Wittgensteinian approach. Although they have not so far been as dominant as the cognitivist accounts, a number of psychologists and philosophers, most notably Peter Hobson, to a lesser extent Michael Tomasello and others, have drawn on Wittgenstein as well as the phenomenological tradition to argue that the cognitivist approach misframes and oversimplifies both the nature of autism and its associated problems. On the one hand, Hobson agrees with the cognitivists that autism originally stems from various innate neuropsychological differences. However, he rejects the notion of a neurocognitive essence, and instead suggests that key autistic differences are more axiological to autistic infants struggling to emotionally connect and attune to others, and thus to interact with others, and in turn to tap into what he calls the shared world of intersubjective meaning. In other words, the likes of Hobson and Tomasello claim that autistic difference is located at the intersubjective level more than the subjective level of individual cognition, and that's so even if its causal genesis lies in the latter in each individual case. For Hobson, what this means is that autism has a relational essence rather than an inherent property. Put another way, autistic problems are not so much a matter of constant processing failures, but rather the downstream effect, for Hobson, of not being properly attuned to a shared form of life, and thus its rules of language and meaning. Because autistic infants do not spontaneously tune in to the emotions of their caregivers and their peers and communities, they also do not instinctively join in primitive reactions with those who share this form of life. In turn, given this diminished spontaneous connectedness and interaction, autistic people find it hard to tap into the shared normative world that guides language learning, this being the scaffolding on the Wittgensteinian framing of our cognitive processes and thus individual understanding. So on Hobson's account, this disrupts cognitive growth during vital formative years, making autism a developmental disorder of the self rather than something like a static cognitive difference. Now, importantly, when we consider the underlying heterogeneity in terms of neurology and cognition, this Wittgensteinian framework may seem preferable to the search for a neurocognitive essence. For the notion that autism has a relational essence, that of being unable to attune to the neurotypical shared world of meaning, is perfectly compatible with autism stemming from a potentially infinite amount of natural variance in terms of cognition and neurology. So in one case it might stem, for example, from sensory integration differences. In another case it could stem from kind of general intellectual disability. In another case it can even stem, according to Hobson, from deafness and blindness. In short, rather than seeing autistic minds as computers with a different processor, as the cognitivists do, on this account, it is more that autistic minds fail to connect to the internet and thus lose many important software updates and so forth as they develop. And just as a failure to connect to the internet can stem from a huge variety of underlying physical causes, so too can an autistic lack of interpersonal relatedness stem from many biological sources. Well, according to Hobson, this shows us the true nature of autism. Critics of Hobson, however, point out that in focusing so heavily on the interpersonal, he forgets the personal, and in particular fails to account for the many autistic people who can and do learn to speak and think, often in highly creative and complex ways. Indeed, more than just overlooking autistic personhood implicitly, Hobson goes so far as to explicitly indicate that the autistic population, while developing autistically, fail to develop as persons or selves, and are thus not part of the community of humanity. So I don't want to go into this here, but this is a very controversial, as an ethical claim, which there are lots of reasons to be sceptical of it, but I'm not going to talk about the ethics and politics to them. Now lastly, when to the cognitivist accounts, as we saw earlier, it is significant that Hobson lacked the benefit of providing us with an account of the subjective experiences of autistic people from the inside out. In focusing so heavily on the interpersonal, and thus looking at autism just from the outside in, he totally overlooks the fruitfulness of cognitivist ability to try and help autistic people learn and understand and deal with characteristically autistic problems from within autistic subjectivity. Perhaps because he doesn't think that autistic individuals are actually people, he never thought to ask anyone what it is like to be autistic. Now at this point, it seems that the cognitivists are too focused on the subjective, whilst the Wittgensteinians are too focused on the intersubjective, a matter of being too inside out, as I put it, or outside in. So it might seem that combining the two accounts together could help us find a middle ground. Unfortunately, however, things are not this simple, for there is another issue, not yet mentioned, that further undermines both accounts. This problem, initially proposed by the philosopher Ian Hacking and further developed by autistic academics Damien Milton and Nicholas Chown and the philosopher Victoria McGeer, has come to be called the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem consists in two parts, together which disrupt the notion that autistic people simply lack a capacity for empathy or interpersonal relatedness when compared with purportedly functional neurotypical. The first aspect of the double empathy problem regards how issues in empathizing or interpersonal relatedness, as Hobson calls it, rather than simply coming from the autistic side, actually go both ways between the autistic and neurotypical populations. As McGeer nicely summarizes, writing from her neurotypical perspective, they are blind to our minds, but so too are we blind to theirs. Indeed, as Milton notes, it is in fact the case that many autistic people become better at understanding neurotypicals than the other way around, because autistic people need to do this to kind of thrive in a neurotypical society, as it were. For a significant proportion of autistics do become proficient at understanding the neurotypical world and manage to blend in, passing as part of it. By contrast, it is not rare for neurotypical psychiatrists and psychologists, for example, who identify as autism experts, to spend their whole careers studying autistic people, only to declare that we are a mystery. Building on this, the second aspect of the double empathy problem regards what I call inter-autistic attunement, this being the fact that autistic people often do seem to intersubjectively attune to other autistic people. As one autistic person writes, if I socialise with other Aspergians, that's his personal term for autism, I guess, with pretty much my own functionality, then all of the so-called social impairments simply don't exist. We share the same operating systems, so there are no impairments. In this regard, despite autistic individuals being framed by Hobson as being outside the human community, autistic communities and culture have in recent decades arisen, largely in light of the internet initially enabling autistic people to connect online. Since the 1990s, autistic people have been able to meet first virtually and then in person, and have developed many communities with autistic social rules, norms, and perhaps most importantly, vocabularies that, according to Hacking, both describe but also in part constitute autistic experience and self-understanding. Now, a particularly striking concrete example I want to share, which I think shows both aspects of the double empathy problem, comes from accounts from Autistic Space. This means space designed by and for autistic people to come together and celebrate and develop autistic culture without interference from neurotypicals. In this regard, Jim Sinclair, who founded Autism Network International, reports how many autistic persons who experience Autistic Space for the first time have, I quote, written moving dramatic accounts of immediately feeling at home among other autistics, having a natural sense of belonging and recognizing other autistics as their own kind of people. Moreover, they regularly use the same planet metaphor, whilst metaphors about speaking the same language or belonging to the same tribe are very common. Simultaneously, Sinclair further reports, neurotypicals who have occasionally been allowed to enter Autistic Space, and I think this only happens when someone has intersecting disabilities and needs a kind of 24-hour carer to assist them, have reported, I quote, feeling anxious, uncertain of what's expected of them, uncertain of whether they're welcome or not, concerned that they may be inadvertently offending people, confused about other people's intentions, worried that everything they do is wrong, and afraid that maybe nobody likes them. Well, this is notable, I think, since the experiences described here from both sides seem to be almost an exact reverse of what we see when autistic individuals reside in neurotypical space, as is usually or almost always the case. So that is, in autistic space, autistic people often do seem to be attuned to those around them and experience the various benefits that come with this, whilst conversely, neurotypicals seemingly experience all the characteristic problems and anxieties associated with a lack of empathy, problems we typically think of as essentially autistic. This is relevant since once we take the double empathy problem into account, then it seems that problems in autistic attunement or empathizing are not a matter of inherent medical deficit, but more a matter of a mismatch between the individual and the environment that they develop within. Now, I think this presents a significant problem for both Hobson's notion that autistic people simply have an inherent inability to emotionally relate, since autistic people can relate to their own kind, as well as for the cognitivist notion that autistic people simply find the social world hard to process, because autistic people can seem to process the autistic social world, whereas neurotypicals seem to have that same deficit, as it were, when trying to process the autistic world. So in order to better understand autism, we cannot simply combine the claims of the cognitivist accounts with those of the Wittgensteinians, such as Hobson, for both seem to not just be wrongs in terms of emphasis, i.e. to outside in or inside out, as I've called them, but rather each has fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about the very nature of autism. I've just given reason to think that both the cognitivist approach and Hobson's account are wrong. Nonetheless, another possibility, which we are now in a position to explore, regards an alternative Wittgensteinian framing that may also help us account for the double empathy problem. For equally, as Victoria McGeer points out on a Wittgensteinian framing, rather than there being a single human form of life which we can either fall just inside or outside of, we can instead say that there are two or more human forms of life, or perhaps that the human form of life is complex enough to have several different subsets. For this would precisely have room for members of each kind being able to attune to members of their own kind, and yet remain unable to attune to members of the other, without needing to make the further claim, which as we have seen is unsustainable, that one side or another simply lacks the capacity for empathy or interpersonal relatedness as such. From the outside in then, McGeer, along with Hacking, hypothesizes that autism is best seen as a form of life which, due to complex social historical circumstances, is only just beginning to emerge as having its own culture and language. That is, autistic people are beginning to connect with each other, largely through the internet as we saw, in order to cultivate the space in which this form of life can go from being deemed a medical pathology to becoming, as it were, a different way of being, no worse for being so different. When it comes to autism, according to McGeer and Hacking, this can be grasped by the Wittgensteinian notion of a form of life with its own language games, even if these language games are still in their infancy. In short, as Hacking writes, emerging autistic narrative is developing a language, or if you will, a new language game, one that is being created before our eyes and ears. This speech is, in turn, creating or extending a way for very unusual people, namely autistic ones, to exist, to be, to live. According to McGeer, the best evidence for this alternative Wittgensteinian framing actually comes from it being able to account for autistic experience from the inside out as well as the outside in. Before Ashley points out, mutual misunderstandings, what we have called the double empathy problem, is just what we would expect if the form of life hypothesis is correct. To elaborate, and although she does not use the term herself, I take it that what she has in mind is most accurately captured as a matter of what Wittgenstein called aspect blindness. For Wittgenstein, aspect blindness refers, as I take it, to whenever someone has some level of understanding but nonetheless misses certain aspects. For example, observing two paintings with some understanding but failing to see a likeness between them, or perhaps understanding someone's action to a good extent but failing to see the cruelty or kindness that lies behind it. The person is also aspect blind whenever they encounter similar problems in regards to understanding facial expressions or figurative language, as well as with things like picking up on humour or irony. Now notably, of course, these are the precise problems that arise between the autistic and neurotypical forms of life, being blind to at least aspects of expressed bodily movements, utterances, and so forth, when expressed by the other population, seem to be the core problem, or one of the core problems, that arises when the divide is crossed. Along with McGeer, I take this to be important as it can help explain autistic experience from within autistic subjectivity too, in a similar way to the cognitivist accounts. However, unlike those accounts, it has the added value of having space to explain it in a way that is consistent with the double empathy problem. From the cognitivist framing, any autistic misunderstanding of the social world might be framed in terms of, say, autistic context blindness or mind blindness, which is then compared to an assumed neurotypical context sensitivity or capacity to mind read. Nonetheless, the alternative notion of aspect blindness in both groups can help account for and explain for the same phenomenon between the two populations, rather than framing autistic people as simply having fruity processing. For, as Victoria McGeer notes, from a Wittgensteinian perspective, social understanding is a species of skilled perception that arises in conjunction with skilled performance in any norm-governed shared practice or form of life. Hence, if one individual is not sufficiently attuned to the shared world or part of the form of life of another individual they are trying to communicate with, then it is precisely in the absence of this guiding context that each will be aspect blind when trying to understand the other. At this point, we have begun to outline something a bit like a general account of the nature of the autistic mind. Nonetheless, so far, this does not help explain all aspects of autistic thinking. For McGeer and Hacking, focus only on autistic social understanding, contrasting the form of life hypothesis with the alternative hypothesis that autistic people simply lack empathy or the capacity for interpersonal relatedness. But as we saw, along with the cognitivist accounts, other than problems in social understanding, the autistic mind has also been associated with other traits, most notably a highly mechanistic, systematic style of thinking. It is then worth saying a bit more about this. As it turns out, we can get further and much richer insights, or so I would contend, from Wittgenstein's further considerations, both regarding certainty and uncertainty, as well as his notion of bewitchment of intelligence by means of language that can arise in light of getting lost in what he sees, on his analogy, as the ancient yet always growing city of meaning and language. Now, in most cases for Wittgenstein, human certainty, that is, our epistemic trust in our knowing, is held in place by a lot of context, thus allowing us to know our way around the city of human meaning. For one person to instantly see that another person is sad, and then to spontaneously know how to react, for instance, this seeing and knowing is held in place by their shared form of life, practices, concerns, and so forth. This is also the case with Wittgenstein when it comes to learning many abstract concepts as we grow. As Wittgenstein writes in On Certainty, the child learns to believe a host of things, i.e. it learns to act according to these beliefs. Bit by bit there forms a system of what is believed, and in that system some things stand unshakably fast and some things are more or less liable to shift. What stands fast does so, not because it's intrinsically obvious or convincing, it is rather held fast by what lies around it. Both our knowing and our underlying epistemic trust, in other words, is held in place by a wider nexus of beliefs and practices. This belief system grows through our developing minds, being constituted by the scaffolding of human convention and agreements in shared forms of life. So on this account, access to knowledge and the certainty that underlies it is not so much a matter of accurate processing, but rather of processing against the background of the shared world. By contrast, however, when we consider the case of someone who develops within, as it were, the wrong form of life, then we would precisely expect them, so to speak, to both lack certain aspects of intuitive knowledge and to lack, in some regards, epistemic trust. For the individual who develops only half attuned to the dominant system of belief will thereby not have their knowledge so firmly held in place. Confusion, conceptual skepticism, and epistemic anxiety we should precisely expect continually arise in day-to-day life. For an ongoing intuitive understanding of the world on the Wittgensteinian account relies on being wholly immersed as part of the form of life, and it is this immersion that autistic people, at least those who develop in neurotypical space, as far as I know, 100% of autistic people right now, seem to lack. Now, interestingly, just as the form of life hypothesis would predict, I would contend that we find examples of precisely this when we read autistic autobiographies. One autistic person, Gunilla Gerland, reports having struggled to communicate her thanks for being provided with food when she was a child. Significantly, she notes, it seemed to others from the outside as if she just did not understand or care about the matter. So she was the very typical, the kind of image of the autistic child who sits there quiet and just isn't speaking or seeming to have any connection with the outside world. That's how it was seen. However, Gunilla herself is keen to stress in retrospect that her communication was hindered by what she experienced as a conceptual problem regarding the essence of food. I quote, "When I had learned the phrase, that thank you, and knew when I was supposed to use it, I nonetheless felt uncertain about what was meant by food when you thank someone for it. Was everything you ate food? Was soup food? Soup was liquid. If soup was food, then perhaps tea was also food, though there were solid bits in soup and there weren't any in tea. But what about porridge? How could you use that phrase when you weren't certain what food was?" It seems to me that what we see here is not so much a lack of knowledge, but rather a lack of spontaneous certainty regarding the essence of food, which in turn brings about anxiety, and thus a kind of drive to try and work out the essence of food reflectively. For she did seem to know more or less what was a good contender for food and what wasn't. It was more that she could not, in her words, be fully certain what food was. A slightly different example, this time in regards to a lack of intuitive understanding more than certainty, comes from Temple Grandin. "On everything in life," she writes, "I was overwhelmed with a mass of details, and I realized that I had to group them together and try to figure out unifying principles for masses of data." Now, in particular, when she was growing up, she described her natural response to not intuitively understanding abstract concepts as a matter of reflectively turning them into pictures. So she's a very, very visual thinker. I quote, "Growing up, I learned to convert abstract ideas into pictures as a way to understand them. I visualized concepts such as peace or honesty with symbolic images. I thought of peace as a dove, an Indian peace pipe, or perhaps a TV or newsreel footage of signing a peace agreement." To an extent, this kind of reflective essentialism helped Grandin to navigate the world and overcome her various anxieties, and thus to blend in with the neurotypical world. Nonetheless, she also gives examples as a kind of which come from her way of her kind of reaction to doing this, of what she calls inappropriate associations. So when reading a magazine article on the Winter Olympics, for example, it used the phrase "all elements are in place." And she kept getting a picture of the periodic table because it used the term elements, and this kind of led to further confusions. Of course, it meant elements as in the kind of the logistics of the Olympics. It was using it in a very different way. She also notes a certain rigidity to her thinking, associating it more with computer processing than neurotypical thinking, a bit like the cognitivist accounts claim. I've just suggested that we can understand at least some autistic problems in understanding as relating to a lack of certainty that comes with the absence of being fully anchored within a shared form of life. But I also think that we might understand the autistic drive to find patterns, generalities, and essences is also a response to the anxieties that arise from this uncertainty. To be clear, this is what the cognitivists call hypersystemizing, but on the form of life hypothesis, as I see it, this is more a very human reaction to the kind of uncertainties and anxieties that arise from developing within an alien form of life, so it's not an essential cognitive trait. As the clinician Tony Atwood notes in regards to his experience of autistic patients, being anxious will affect the person's thinking and lead to the development of strategies to reduce the level of anxiety. For example, when a person with Asperger's is anxious, his or her thinking tends to become more rigid. Well, this response is not in itself an autistic one, but rather one that all humans are prone to in light of epistemic angst. The difference is just, as we have seen, that autistic people who develop in neurotypical space will be much more prone to experiencing this when compared to those who dwell and develop among their own kind, as it were. In this regard, Wittgenstein provides further insight with what he calls the craving for generality, as well as the various intellectual pathologies he associates with this craving. Initially, in Wittgenstein's analysis, when epistemic uncertainty or conceptual confusion and so forth arises, we can experience what he describes variously as angst or disquietude. And in light of being gripped by this, he further notes, we can be overcome by this craving for generality that compels us towards oversimplifying, generalizing, searching for rigid essences and so forth, that we think will help cure us of the angst that arises when certainty or understanding breaks down. Very significantly, in turn, he further stresses, if this happens enough, we can also thereby get caught up in a specific picture of language as such, one which takes meaning to be fixed and rigid rather than fluid and shifting. For if we take the meaning of words to be found by searching for timeless essences or perhaps pictures, in the hope that this will quell our anxieties, then we will be tempted, at least implicitly, to view language and meaning themselves as a kind of rigid fixed system. Now this kind of essentialist systemizing, as we have seen with the examples of Temple Grandin's pictures and so forth, may help autistic people to some extent. By the way, I just want to say, I should say here, I think autistic systemizing is really brilliant in lots of contexts. It's not just a bad thing. I'm only concerned with it here when it can be associated with kind of distress or disablement. So autistic systemizing is brilliant where it's appropriate, I think. Now this picture of language is also implicit in Baron Cohen's attempt to help facilitate autistic navigation of the social world in his interactive DVD containing the 412 facial expressions. For the notion that social information can be turned into a system that can then be learned and memorized and reflectively mapped onto the world precisely seems to rely on the picture of language that frames it as a matter of fixed essences in this. Well, this seems to help to some extent too. But the problem here, as Wittgenstein saw, is that the implicit picture of language underlying such systemizing attempts is misguided, and in turn becoming held captive by this picture can lead us to continually encounter such problems in day-to-day life, even whilst we hope it will precisely quell them. For language and meaning, on the Wittgensteinian account, simply are not a matter of fixed essences unbound by social context. While systemizing and essentialism in regards to meaning may seem to help for a while, all such attempts in taking meaning out of context, the context that gives language its living breath, will sooner or later be found wanting. According to Wittgenstein's analysis, the outcome of this response to life's anxieties is that those captivated by this picture of language will find themselves caught up in the Sisyphean task of trying, time and time again, to systemize that which cannot be systemized. Now, when considering the relevance of this, it is very interesting to turn back to Gunilla Gerland, who I quoted above. She discussed the essence of food. She very clearly elaborates on her tendency to systemize and its correlating problems in precisely this way. I quote, "I desperately wanted to understand, and this led to theories, but there were always exceptions that made me doubt my theory. This doubt was a painful feeling, and I was a mental marionette hanging in the strings of theories. Whenever theories didn't fit and I could find nothing new to hang on, I was unable to move mentally, so I had to create new theories all the time." Here we seem to see precisely a continued attempt to systemize in lack of the spontaneous understanding and certainty, and yet at the same time this always leaves her seeking more and more precise definitions and systems, since whenever her theories were challenged, she found herself again and again back to square one, as it were, distressed and disabled by her epistemic angst and uncertainty. To the outside world, recall, she simply seemed to lack the capacity to understand or think abstractly as such. The point I'm trying to make here, to summarize more clearly, is something more like this. Autistic systemizing, I take it, is not so much a matter of innate cognitive drive to systemize, but rather a very natural and understandable human reaction that arises in light of a lack of epistemic trust, that can in turn lead us to succumb to a certain picture of language, and this can just make the systemizing go further and further, as it were. It is this combination, especially, that makes it, at least some autistic people seem like hypersystemizers, unable to process anything vague or ambiguous. For whenever one develops in the form of life that is not one's native form of life, as it were, this will inevitably give rise to the precise kinds of anxieties that compel us towards rigid, essentialistic thinking, partly as this can be comforting and provides at least the hope of quelling our epistemic angst. But crucially, as Wittgenstein points out, and as we see more concretely in the autistic self-reports I have provided, this kind of thinking does not lead to the comfort we expect it to, since it both relies on and reinforces an implicit picture of language that leads to further problems, at least often, rather than solving them. I certainly do not take myself to have explained all aspects of autistic thinking, some of which clearly relate to the underlying neurology and so forth, right? I have just attempted to give what I think is at least the beginnings of a general account of the autistic mind, however, that accounts for both the double empathy problem, unlike the previous accounts, and has room for the underlying heterogeneity in terms of the neurology and so forth. If my analysis has been at all convincing, I think this is significant for a number of reasons. The most significant, however, does not lie in its explanatory power, and instead regards how the kinds of problems I have just discussed for Wittgenstein are definitely not a matter of faulty cognition or intellectual disability in a medical sense, but rather a matter of having been misled by a certain manner of thinking and a correlating picture of language, as we saw, one that we think will help quell our anxieties, but which in fact tends to reinforce our tendency to run into similar problems again and again and again. For these rigid systems, despite being calming in the short term, will inevitably crash against the fluid world of language and meaning. In this regard, what seems most relevant to me is that Wittgenstein does not just inadvertently offer to help a diagnosis for the kinds of problems we associate with autism, he also offers the beginnings of a way out of them. For in light of his analysis of this tendency, which he found above all in himself, and although he did not have autism in mind, of course, when he was writing, Wittgenstein spent much of his philosophical career developing practical methods and advice for those who found themselves lost or uncertain in the various ways we have been considering. Although I cannot do his insights full justice here, I want to end by saying a bit about this at least. In particular, one of his core proposals was to stop trying to think, i.e. linguistically and systematically and so forth, when we find ourselves anxious or uncertain, and instead to look. For on the one hand, conceptual confusion, on his view, has its roots in relatively superficial kind of logical and linguistic thinking that compels us precisely to develop systems or seek essences in ways that are bracketed off from and thus divorced from the forms of life that provide meaning. By contrast, if we stop and look at the way that words are used within forms of life, rather than thinking about their essence, we will be much better placed to come to properly understand them, and our anxieties will thus be quelled. Relatedly, a second core proposal regards beginning to think of meaning as often, albeit not always, as consisting in family resemblances, rather than as being a matter of essential properties. Much as how two family members might have similar eyes, whilst another two members might have very different eyes but similar humour, and so forth, giving them all overlapping resemblances, despite them sharing no single essential trait, so too can the way words are used have many overlapping meanings without having a fixed essence. Rather, much in the way an ancient city grows slowly over time, and in relation to many human concerns and needs, so too is language multi-layered, complex, overlapping, and shifting in relation to our similarly shifting forms of life. This is significant since coming to accept this is important, as changing the picture of language one has, from the essentialist to the Wittgensteinian, has methodological consequences. If you give up believing that concepts must have essences that we can only find, for example, through rigorous linguistic or pictorial thinking, you will abandon the method of trying to understand things by systemizing towards finding these essences. Instead, you will do what Wittgenstein called looking, not thinking. By contrast to essentialist systemizing, and although I guess Wittgenstein was not against systematic thinking, as I am, where it is appropriate or helpful, Wittgenstein proposed striving towards what he called the kind of understanding which consists in seeing connections. One way of understanding this, and this is somewhat oversimplified of course, might be as a method of overcoming aspect blindness and in some cases epistemological uncertainty and so forth, by looking around at the world and at the ways things relate to each other in order to gain a different kind of understanding. That is, the kind of understanding that consists in seeing connections is more a matter, in a sense, of learning to look in the right way, perhaps with the right attitude, rather than a matter of reflective, systematic thinking. Now, very significantly, in contrast to those examples already discussed, we can also see this kind of thinking emerging in at least some autistic people. On Jim Sinclair's analysis of their autistic thinking, for example, the gaps in they use the term gaps. The gaps in Sinclair's understanding give a kind of increased freedom in terms of skeptical and intellectual inquiry, since many of the presuppositions that neurotypicals begin with are lacking. Other people's assumptions, Sinclair writes, are usually much more resistant to learning than my ignorance. Given this, Sinclair goes on, figuring out things and finding connections between different parts of a whole are what I do best. And I get a lot of practice because not many of the connections go into place by themselves. To give another example, another autistic lady, Amanda Baggs, has written of what she calls perceiving connections without force-fitting a set of thoughts on top of them. For her, this kind of thinking is a matter of seeing what she calls patterns, albeit not, she stresses, in terms of categories, the latter being something she associates more with neurotypical thinking. This is somewhat speculative, but it seems to me from reading their writings, neither Baggs nor Sinclair come across as hypersystemizers, although they do have the same underlying aspect blindness and lack of epistemic certainty and gaps in understanding, what Sinclair calls as gaps or ignorance, that we have seen elsewhere. Although I take it, of course, they have not read Wittgenstein, it does seem that their response to me is slightly more in line with his, and in turn they seem more at ease, in some sense more able to both affirm their differences and at the same time navigate the neurotypical world without constantly being overwhelmed by the anxiety that those who take more of a hyper-systemizing route do. As Sinclair writes, my personhood is intact, my selfhood is undamaged, I find great value and meaning in my life, and I have no wish to be cured of being myself. Similarly, Baggs is keen to stress that her way of seeing brings what she calls a different kind of richness, no worse for being so different. She too seems to have come to terms with herself and her world in such a way that does not require hypersystemizing, and in turn the anxieties and kind of rigidness that comes with this. What we see here then is the same underlying differences in mind that come from developing within an alien form of life, and yet perhaps at least in part due to resisting the picture of language and the kinds of ways of thinking that is all too tempting for so many autistic people, Sinclair and Baggs seem to manage to have learned to affirm their lack of certainty rather than succumbing to angst and rigidity in light of it. Now, although I cannot prove the direct causal connection in these cases, I take this to be the kind of route to thriving that Wittgenstein has in mind when he asks us to stop thinking and instead to look. Thank you.